The Galactic Concordat had watched Earth for over 3,000 years, and they had never expected anything good to come from that violent little world spinning in the outer arm of the galaxy. Their observation probes had recorded everything about the planet, and the data made even the most hardened scientists feel sick with horror. Earth was classified as a Class 12 Deathworld, which meant it was one of the most dangerous planets ever discovered in the known universe. The gravity was crushing and heavy compared to most civilized worlds, and the atmosphere was filled with a corrosive gas called oxygen that would burn the lungs of most species. Massive tectonic plates shifted beneath the surface and caused earthquakes that could level entire cities in seconds. Volcanoes erupted with such fury that they blocked out the sun for years at a time. The weather was equally insane, with hurricanes that could span entire oceans and tornadoes that tore across the land like the fingers of angry gods. Lightning struck the ground millions of times every single day, and floods drowned vast regions, while droughts turned others into wastelands of death. But the weather and geology were not even the worst parts of Earth. The life forms on that planet had evolved in a constant state of war against each other and against the environment itself. Predators with razor-sharp teeth hunted in packs and used coordinated tactics that showed disturbing intelligence. Microscopic organisms invaded the bodies of larger creatures and killed them from within in ways that seemed almost deliberately cruel. Parasites ate their hosts alive from the inside, and viruses mutated so fast that no immune system could keep up with them forever. Venomous creatures injected toxins that could stop a heart in minutes, and some plants had evolved to digest living animals that wandered too close. The Concordat scientists who studied Earth agreed on one simple conclusion, and that conclusion was that no intelligent species could possibly evolve on such a nightmarish world. They were completely and utterly wrong. When the first human vessel broke through the edge of their solar system and activated its primitive faster-than-light drive, the Concordat detected it immediately. The ship was called the Uns Magellan, and it carried a crew of 200 humans on what they called a mission of exploration. The Concordat Council convened an emergency session to discuss this unexpected development, and the debate lasted for several cycles. Some members argued that the humans should be destroyed immediately before they could spread their Deathworld contamination across the galaxy. Others suggested quarantine and isolation to keep the dangerous creatures contained in their own system. But the Sithrani ambassador named Velthrix proposed a different approach, and her species was famous throughout the galaxy for their mastery of diplomacy and negotiation. The Sithrani had brokered peace between more than 1,000 warring civilizations, and they had never once failed to bring even the most stubborn species into the fold of the Concordat. Velthrix argued that the humans were clearly primitive and desperate, and that they would eagerly accept protection and guidance from the more advanced civilizations of the galaxy. She proposed offering them a standard protectorate treaty, which would give humans access to advanced technology in medicine and protection from external threats. In exchange, the humans would simply need to accept Concordat oversight of their government and military and surrender their sovereignty to the greater galactic community. It was a generous offer in the eyes of the Concordat, and every species that had received such an offer in the past had accepted it with gratitude and relief. The council approved Velthrix's mission as she assembled her finest diplomatic team for the journey to meet the humans. Her ship was magnificent and gleaming, and filled with gifts meant to impress the primitive Deathworlders. There were examples of advanced technology and samples of rare medicines and works of art from across the galaxy. Velthrix rehearsed her speech 100 times and practiced her most reassuring expressions and prepared for what she assumed would be a simple negotiation. The Sithrani vessel intercepted the Uns Magellan near a gas giant in the outer reaches of the human system, and Velthrix broadcast her greeting in every language her translators had decoded from human transmissions. Captain Helena Vasquez responded to the hail, and invited the diplomatic delegation aboard her ship. Velthrix was immediately uncomfortable when she stepped onto the human vessel because the gravity was so much heavier than she was used to, and the air smelled strange and harsh. The humans themselves were even more unsettling than she had expected. They were tall and solid, and moved with a predatory grace that made her instincts scream danger. Their eyes tracked movement with the focus of hunters, and their bodies were covered in lean muscle that spoke of physical power. But Captain Vasquez smiled and welcomed the delegation with warm words, and Velthrix forced herself to relax. The negotiations began in the conference room. Aboard the Magellan, and Velthrix presented her offer with all the skill and charm her species was famous for. She spoke of the wonders of the Concordat and the benefits of membership, and the protection that humanity would receive from threats they could not yet imagine. She presented the treaty document and highlighted the technology transfers and medical advances that humans would gain access to. Captain Vasquez listened politely and asked thoughtful questions and reviewed the treaty with her advisors for several hours. When she returned to the negotiating table, her expression was calm, but her eyes had grown cold. She pointed to a section of the treaty that outlined the transfer of human sovereignty to Concordat oversight, and she asked Velthrix to explain exactly what that meant. Velthrix explained that humans would retain local governance, but that major decisions regarding military and expansion and foreign policy would be subject to Concordat approval. She assured Vasquez that this was standard procedure and that it was for humanity's own protection. Vasquez nodded slowly, and then she declined the offer. Velthrix was confused because no species had ever refused before, and she asked if perhaps there had been a translation error. Vasquez said there was no error, and that humanity would not surrender its right to determine its own future, regardless of what benefits were offered. The ambassador pressed harder and suggested that refusing the Concordat's generous terms might have consequences that humanity was not prepared to face. Vasquez leaned back in her chair and smiled in a way that made Velthrix's blood run cold. She said that on Earth humans had a saying about speaking softly and carrying a big stick, and that so far humanity had been speaking very softly indeed. Then she asked if the ambassador would like to see the stick. Velthrix declined and departed the human vessel. With her delegation and her gifts still unpresented, her report to the Concordat Council was troubling, and she warned them that these Deathworlders were unlike any species they had encountered before. The humans were not grateful or awed or desperate, and they did not seem to understand that they were supposed to be afraid. The council dismissed her concerns and assumed that the humans would eventually come around once they realized how alone and outmatched they truly were. That assumption would prove to be the greatest mistake in galactic history. The Concordat Council gathered in their great chamber on the capital world of Sifros, primed to discuss what they had begun calling the human problem. Representatives from over 1,000 species filled the massive hall, and their voices created a constant hum of debate and argument. The Sithrani delegation urged patience and continued diplomatic efforts because surely the primitive Deathworlders would eventually recognize the wisdom of joining the galactic community. Other species agreed and suggested that perhaps the initial offer had been too aggressive and that a gentler approach might yield better results. But one voice cut through the debate with harsh clicking sounds that silenced the chamber. High Commander Zrixtol of the Kethvari rose from his seat, and his insectoid body towered over the other delegates. Like a nightmare given form, the Kethvari were a warrior species who had conquered their way into the Concordat 300 years ago, and they had never lost that hunger for battle and dominance. Zrixtol's exoskeleton was covered in the scars of 100 campaigns, and his compound eyes gleamed with cold intelligence as he addressed the assembly. He declared that the humans had insulted the entire Concordat by refusing the generous offer of protectorate status, and that such defiance could not be tolerated. If word spread that a primitive species could simply say no to the Concordat, then other worlds might begin to question their own membership, and the entire structure of galactic civilization could crumble. The solution was simple and obvious, and Zrixtal was surprised that no one else had proposed it yet. The humans needed to be taught a lesson, and the Kethvari were more than willing to serve as the teachers. He proposed a police action consisting of a single Kethvari battle fleet that would travel to the human system and demonstrate the true power of the Concordat. The Deathworlders had barely mastered faster than light travel, and their weapons were laughably primitive compared to Kethvari technology. They used chemical propellants to launch metal projectiles and crude nuclear devices that any civilized species had abandoned thousands of years ago. A show of overwhelming force would break their spirit, and they would accept whatever terms the Concordat chose to offer them. Some delegates raised concerns about the ethics of attacking a species that had done nothing wrong except refuse a treaty Zrixtal dismissed these objections with contempt and reminded the assembly that the Kethvari had subjugated dozens of species during their rise to power, and that none of those conquests had destabilized the Concordat. In fact, the conquered species had eventually come to appreciate the order and stability that Kethvari rule provided. The debate continued for several more cycles, but in the end, the council voted to approve the police action. They placed restrictions on Zrixtal's forces and forbade the complete destruction of humanity, because even the Concordat had some standards. But they gave him permission to use whatever force was necessary to compel human submission. Zrixtal assembled his fleet with eager anticipation, because it had been too long since the Kethvari had tasted real combat. 300 warships gathered at the staging point near the border of explored space, and each vessel was crewed by warriors who had trained their entire lives for battle. The fleet included dreadnoughts bristling with plasma cannons and particle beam projectors and missile batteries capable of cracking planets. Carrier ships held thousands of fighter craft piloted by Kethvari aces who had never known defeat. Support vessels carried enough supplies and ammunition to sustain a campaign lasting years, though Zrixtal expected the operation to be over within days. The fleet made the jump to faster than light travel and crossed a vast distance to the human system in a matter of weeks. When they emerged from hyperspace near the outer planets, Zrixtal ordered his communications officer to broadcast the ultimatum. The message was simple and direct, as the Kethvari preferred humanity had one standard rotation to surrender unconditionally and accept whatever terms the Concordat chose to impose. If they refused, then the fleet would begin systematic bombardment of human colonies, starting with the outer settlements and working inward toward Earth itself. Zrixtal expected panic and desperate pleas for negotiation, and perhaps some futile attempt at resistance before the humans accepted the inevitable. Instead, the response came from Earth itself, and it was not what anyone in the fleet had anticipated. Every nation on the human homeworld had apparently received the ultimatum simultaneously, and, for the first time in their species' history, they had reached unanimous agreement on something. The transmission that reached the Kethvari fleet was a formal declaration of war, signed by every single government on Earth. There were no requests for negotiation, and no pleas for mercy, and no attempts to bargain for better terms. The humans simply stated that they would fight, and that they would never surrender, and that any Kethvari who entered their system should be prepared to die. Zrixtal's officers chittered with amusement at the bravado of these primitive creatures. What could a species that had barely reached the stars possibly do against the might of a Kethvari battle fleet? Their ships were slow and poorly armored, and their weapons could barely scratch the paint on a Kethvari cruiser. The High Commander ordered his fleet to advance toward the inner system at a leisurely pace because there was no need to rush. He wanted the humans to see death coming for them slowly and to have time to reconsider their foolish defiance. But as the fleet moved deeper into human space, Zrixtal noticed something strange in the sensor readings. The human ships were not gathering to defend their colonies in the outer system as expected. Instead, they seemed to be falling back toward the inner planets in a pattern that almost looked like a deliberate withdrawal. His tactical officers assured him that this was simply the humans recognizing their inferiority and retreating in the face of overwhelming force. Zrixtal accepted this explanation, but some small part of his warrior instincts felt uneasy. The humans were Deathworlders after all, and Deathworlders did not survive by running away from threats. They survived by adapting and fighting and finding ways to kill things that should have been able to kill them. The High Commander pushed these thoughts aside and focused on the campaign ahead. He would show these primitive creatures the true meaning of war, and they would learn to kneel before the Kethvari, whether they wanted to or not. What Zrixtal did not understand was that the humans had been fighting wars since before they learned to make fire. They had spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of killing each other, and they had developed tactics and strategies that would have horrified any civilized species. And now, for the first time in their bloody history, they were completely united against a common enemy. The Kethvari thought they were about to teach the humans a lesson about war. In truth, the humans were about to teach the Kethvari what war really meant. The first battle of the war took place in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, and it did not go the way High Commander Zrixtal had expected. His advanced scouts reported a small human fleet hiding among the tumbling rocks, and the High Commander dispatched a squadron of cruisers to destroy them. The cruisers moved into the asteroid field with confidence because their sensors were superior and their weapons outranged anything the humans possessed. They detected the human ships clustered together near a large asteroid, and they opened fire with plasma cannons that should have vaporized the primitive vessels instantly. But the human ships were not where the sensors said they were. The readings had been spoofed by decoys that the humans had scattered throughout the field, and the real ships were hiding in the sensor shadows of the asteroids themselves. The first Kethvari cruiser exploded when a human vessel that had been playing dead suddenly accelerated and rammed directly into its engine section. The ship had been packed with nuclear warheads, and the explosion tore through 3 more cruisers before anyone could react. The remaining Kethvari vessels tried to regroup, but the humans were everywhere at once. They burst from hiding spots behind asteroids and fired missiles at point-blank range, and then vanished back into the maze of spinning rocks before the Kethvari could return fire. One human captain flew his damaged frigate directly into the bridge of a HFY Kethvari destroyer, and the collision killed everyone on both ships. Another human commander used her vessel as a shield to protect a troop transport that was evacuating a mining colony, and she died with her hands still on the firing controls. The squadron that Zrixtal had sent to destroy a handful of primitive ships lost 8 cruisers before they managed to retreat. The High Commander was furious, but he told himself that this was merely a setback caused by overconfidence. He gathered his full fleet and pushed toward Mars with overwhelming force, and the humans could not possibly defeat 300 warships with their tricks and ambushes. The Battle of Mars proved him wrong again. The humans had fortified the Red Planet with orbital defense platforms that fired kinetic projectiles at incredible velocities. These were not elegant plasma weapons or sophisticated particle beams, but simply chunks of metal accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light. The impacts tore through Kethvari shields like they were not even there, and the sheer primitive brutality of the weapons shocked the alien commanders. Ground-based railguns joined the bombardment, and human fighters swarmed out of hidden bases beneath the Martian surface. The Kethvari pilots were skilled and experienced, but they had never fought enemies like this. Human pilots flew with a recklessness that bordered on insanity, and they seemed completely unconcerned about their own survival. They rammed enemy fighters when they ran out of ammunition, and they flew through debris fields that should have been impossible to navigate. One human ace named Lieutenant James Okonjo destroyed 17 Kethvari fighters before his craft was finally disabled. And even then, he managed to crash his dying ship into a HFY carrier deck. The battle lasted for 3 days, and the HFY eventually took Mars, but they lost 47 ships in the process. Driscoll had expected to lose perhaps 5 vessels in the entire campaign, and now he had lost nearly 50 before even reaching Earth. The reports from the occupied human colonies were equally disturbing. When the HFY bombarded settlements into submission, the survivors did not surrender as expected. Instead, they went underground and began guerrilla campaigns that bled the occupation forces dry. Human resistance fighters attacked supply convoys and assassinated officers and sabotaged equipment with a creativity that seemed almost supernatural. They fought in environments that killed HFY soldiers within minutes. Some human guerrillas operated in volcanic regions where the heat would cook a HFY inside its exoskeleton. Others fought in frozen wastelands where the cold made HFY limbs too brittle to move. They used biological weapons derived from Earth organisms that were so toxic that entire HFY battalions died screaming. The Concordat Council began receiving casualty reports that made even the most hawkish members uncomfortable. The HFY were losing soldiers at a rate that was simply unsustainable, and the humans showed no signs of weakening. If anything, they seemed to be getting stronger with every passing month. Human scientists worked without sleep to reverse engineer captured HFY technology, and within 6 months, they had cracked the secrets of plasma weapons. Within a year, they had improved on the designs, and human ships began carrying weapons that matched or exceeded HFY firepower. Their factories operated around the clock, and human workers pushed themselves beyond all reasonable limits to produce more ships and more weapons. They ingested stimulants that would have killed members of most other species, and they worked until they collapsed, and then they got up and worked some more. The humans called it total war, and it was a concept that the civilized galaxy had never truly understood. Every human became a soldier in some capacity, whether they fought on the front lines or built weapons in factories or grew food to feed the war effort. Children learned to assemble ammunition, and elderly citizens repaired damaged equipment, and no one was exempt from the struggle. The HFY had expected a quick campaign against primitive savages, but instead they found themselves locked in a war of attrition against an enemy that simply refused to stop fighting. Admiral Chen Wei demonstrated the true nature of human warfare at the Battle of Proxima Centauri. Our fleet was outnumbered 4-1, and any rational commander would have retreated to fight another day. Instead, she ordered her ships to fly directly through the corona of the local star. The maneuver was so insane that HFY tactical computers flagged it as a sensor error and assumed the human ships had been destroyed when Chen Wei's fleet emerged on the other side of the star with their hulls glowing from the heat. The HFY were caught completely off guard. Half the human fleet had been destroyed by the passage, but the survivors fell upon the enemy formation from an unexpected angle and annihilated them completely. Chen Wei became a legend among both humans and HFY that day, and her name was whispered with fear in the halls of HFY Command. The war that was supposed to last weeks had now stretched into years, and the HFY were no closer to victory than they had been at the start. High Commander Zrickstill finally began to understand what he was truly facing. These were not primitives to be conquered, but Deathworlders who had been forged in the fires of the most hostile planet in the known galaxy, and they were just getting started. By the 3rd year of the war, the HFY Empire was bleeding from 1,000 wounds, and humanity had transformed from desperate defenders into relentless hunters. The human war machine had grown beyond anything the Concordat had thought possible. For such a young species, shipyards that had not existed 3 years ago now produced dozens of warships every month, and each new vessel incorporated lessons learned from battles. Past human engineers had not simply copied HFY technology, but had improved it in ways that made alien scientists question everything they thought they knew about physics. The plasma weapons on human ships burned hotter and reached farther than their HFY equivalents. Human shields flickered with an adaptive frequency that made them nearly impossible to penetrate with sustained fire, and the crews who operated these vessels were veterans of the most brutal conflict the galaxy had ever seen. Admiral Chun Wei had become the supreme commander of human offensive operations after her legendary victory at Proxima, and she had assembled a fleet that struck terror into every HFY heart. Strategy was simple and brutal, and it reflected everything that made humanity so dangerous. She did not simply defend human space, but pushed outward into HFY territory with a methodical aggression that never paused or slowed. The first HFY colony world fell within weeks of the offensive beginning. Human marines dropped from orbit in armored pods and fought through defensive positions that should have held for months. They moved through toxic atmospheres that killed unprotected HFY, and they shrugged off wounds that would have incapacitated any other species. The garrison commander surrendered after 3 days of continuous combat, and he later reported that the humans had not slept even once during the entire battle. More colony worlds followed, and each victory brought new resources and new allies to the human cause. The HFY had conquered dozens of species during their rise to power, and those subject peoples had never forgotten. Their chains human agents made contact with resistance movements on occupied worlds, and they taught the locals the art of guerrilla warfare that had been perfected on Earth over thousands of years. Slave species that had been broken and docile for generations suddenly remembered how to fight, and HFY occupation forces found themselves facing rebellions on every world they controlled. The Concordat Council watched these developments with growing alarm, and the diplomatic faction led by the Sithrani demanded an emergency session to address the crisis. Ambassador Velthrix delivered a report that made the assembled delegates fall silent. With dread, she had spent the past 2 years studying human history and culture, and what she had learned kept her awake at night. Humans did not simply wage war the way civilized species did, with limited objectives and negotiated endings. They waged what they called total war, which meant the complete mobilization of their entire society toward the destruction of their enemies. Throughout their history, they had fought conflicts that killed millions of their own kind, and they had rebuilt and fought again without any apparent psychological damage. They had developed weapons capable of destroying their entire planet, and they had come within minutes of using those weapons against each other on multiple occasions. The only reason they had not annihilated themselves was that they had always found a new enemy to unite against at the last moment. And now humanity had found the ultimate enemy in the form of the HFY, and every ounce of their terrifying capacity for violence was focused outward. Velthrix concluded her report with a warning that made several delegates physically ill. The humans were not fighting to defend themselves anymore. They were fighting to ensure that no one would ever threaten them again, and they would not stop until that goal was achieved. High Commanders Rixtel transmitted desperate requests for reinforcements, but the other Concordat species had begun quietly withdrawing their support. The war had been sold as a quick police action, and no one had signed up for a multi-year conflict against Deathworld maniacs. The HFY had started this war alone, and now they would have to finish it. Alone, human fleets pushed deeper into HFY space with each passing month, and the alien empire that had once terrorized the galaxy began to crumble. Colony after colony fell, and the HFY Navy suffered defeat after defeat. General Sarah Akanjo commanded the ground forces that liberated the slave worlds, and she became almost as famous as Admiral Chen Weishi was the daughter of the pilot who had died crashing into a HFY carrier at Mars, and she fought with a cold fury that terrified her enemies. But unlike the HFY, she showed mercy to those who surrendered, and she protected civilians even when military necessity suggested otherwise. This Mercy proved to be one of humanity's most effective weapons. Word spread among the HFY population that surrender to humans meant survival, while continued resistance meant death. Garrison commanders began surrendering rather than fighting to the last soldier, and each surrender accelerated the collapse of the empire. The final campaign began when human forces reached the HFY homeworld of Keth Prime. The planet was heavily defended, with orbital fortresses and ground-based weapons and a fleet of warships that represented everything the HFY had left. High Commander Zrixtal had returned to lead the defense personally, and he swore that he would never surrender to the Deathworld. Savage's General Okonjo broadcast a message to the HFY civilian population before the attack began. She spoke in their own language, which she had learned during the campaign, and her words were carefully chosen to offer hope. The humans had no quarrel with ordinary HFY citizens, she said, and those who wished to live in peace would be allowed to do so. War was with the military leaders who had attacked humanity without provocation, and with those who had ordered atrocities against human. Civilians' surrender would be accepted, and prisoners would be treated with dignity, and the HFY people would be allowed to rebuild their civilization under their own governance. Rixel ordered his communications officers to jam the transmission. But it was too late. The message had already spread across the planet, and it had reached something that Zrixtal had not anticipated. Jerry dissidents, who had opposed the war from the beginning, had been in contact with human intelligence for months. They had watched their empire crumble, and they had decided that their only hope for survival was to end the war before humanity decided to end it. HFY species entirely, when Zrixtal ordered his fleet to engage the approaching human armada. Half of his ships refused to respond. Captains, who had served the empire for their entire lives, transmitted their surrenders and powered down their weapons. The defending fleet tore itself apart in a brief civil war, and when the shooting stopped, the humans had won without firing a single shot. Zrixtal tried to flee, but his own officers arrested him and delivered him to human custody. The war ended not with the extinction of the HFY, but with a trial where Zrixtal was held accountable for his crimes against sapient life. Humanity had proven that they could be both terrible in war and merciful in victory, and the galaxy would. The great assembly hall on Sithros Prime had never been so quiet as it was on the day humanity came to answer for its actions before the Galactic Concordat. Representatives from over 1,000 species filled the curved benches that rose toward the domed ceiling, and every eye was fixed on the human delegation that stood at the center of the chamber. The humans had been summoned to explain what the Concordat officially called their aggressive expansion into sovereign HFY territory. Many delegates expected the Deathworlders to arrive with threats and demands, and perhaps even weapons. Instead, the human delegation consisted of only 12 individuals dressed in simple formal attire and led by a woman whose name had become known across the galaxy. Ambassador Helena Vasquez had been Captain Vasquez when she refused the first Concordat Treaty, and she had spent the war years coordinating the diplomatic efforts that had turned subject species against their HFY masters. She walked to the speaker's platform with a calm confidence that made several nearby delegates shift nervously in their seats. The Sithrani High Chancellor opened the proceedings with a formal reading of the charges against humanity. The list was long and included unauthorized military action and destruction of Concordat, member property, and interference in the internal affairs of sovereign species. When the reading was finished, the Chancellor invited Ambassador Vasquez to respond. She stood in silence for a long moment and let her gaze sweep across the assembled delegates. Then she spoke in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of the vast chamber. She said that the Concordat had sent diplomats to humanity's doorstep with chains hidden behind their backs. When humans refused the generous offer of slavery, the Concordat had sent warships to force compliance. Humanity had defended itself, and humanity had won, and now the Concordat demanded explanations. Vasquez paused and let that word hang in the air. She asked the assembly if perhaps they had confused humans with one of the species that still trembled at the Concordat's displeasure. Several delegates shifted uncomfortably, and a few made sounds of protest, but no one interrupted. Vasquez continued by explaining exactly what humanity was prepared to offer. The Concordat peace was the first item on the list, and she emphasized that humans had no desire to continue fighting. They wanted to explore the stars alongside other species, and they wanted to trade goods and knowledge and culture. They wanted to establish embassies and exchange students and build relationships that would benefit everyone. They did not want Kethvari territory, and they were prepared to return most of the worlds they had conquered to local governance. They did not want to rule the galaxy, and they had no interest in building an empire that would rival or replace the Concordat. They simply wanted to be left alone to determine their own destiny among the stars. But then her voice hardened and the temperature in the chamber seemed to drop. She said that humanity also wanted the assembled delegates to understand something very clearly. Humans came from a world that had tried to kill them every single day of their existence as a species. They had survived ice ages that had frozen their planet from pole to pole. They had survived plagues that had killed more than half their population in single outbreaks. They had survived predators and parasites and natural disasters that would have driven any other species to extinction. And they had survived each other because humans had been fighting wars among themselves since before they learned to write. Every generation of humanity had been forged in conflict, and every conflict had taught them new ways to fight and to survive and to win. The Kethvari had thought they understood war, but they had only ever fought civilized opponents who followed rules and accepted defeat when the odds turned against them. Humans did not fight that way, and they never had. When humans went to war, they did not stop until the threat was completely and permanently eliminated. Vasquez looked directly at the Sithrani High Chancellor, and her eyes were cold. She said that humanity would prefer to be friends with the Concordat and with every species in the galaxy. They would prefer to spend their energy on exploration and discovery and the advancement of knowledge. But if anyone came for them again, they would not simply defend their borders. They would hunt their enemies across the galaxy, and they would burn their worlds, and they would salt the ground, so nothing would ever grow there again. They would not stop at their enemies' capitals, and they would not accept surrender until they were absolutely certain that the threat could never rise again. This was not a boast or a threat, but simply a statement of fact about how humans dealt with existential dangers. The chamber was utterly silent. Vasquez softened her tone slightly and said that she hoped it would never come to that. Humanity had learned something during the war that their enemies had never understood. Victory through destruction was hollow and unsatisfying because it left nothing but ashes and grief. The humans who had fought and died in the war had not done so merely to survive, but to build a future worth living. In that future included the species of the Concordat, whether they realized it or not. Humanity was willing to share its knowledge and its medicine and its stubborn refusal to accept impossible odds. They would teach any species that wanted to learn how to fight for themselves and how to stand up to bullies and tyrants. They would trade and negotiate and compromise like any civilized people, but they would never bow, and they would never kneel, and they would never again allow themselves to be threatened without response. Vasquez concluded by offering the Concordat a simple choice. They could accept humanity as equals and build a future together that would benefit everyone, or they could refuse and live in fear of what the Deathworlders might do next. The choice was theirs. She stepped back from the platform and waited. The debate that followed lasted for 3 full cycles, and voices rose in anger and fear and desperate hope. Some delegates demanded that the Concordat assemble every fleet and crush the human menace before it grew any stronger. Others pointed out that the Kethvari had tried exactly that and had been utterly destroyed. The Sithrani faction argued for acceptance, because humanity had already demonstrated that it could be reasoned with when treated fairly. In the end, the vote was not even close. Species after species chose peace over the prospect of facing human wrath, and the final tally showed overwhelming support for accepting humanity's terms. The treaty was signed in a ceremony that was broadcast across the galaxy, and Ambassador Vasquez shook hands with the Sithrani High Chancellor while 1,000 species watched. In the years that followed, humanity spread across the stars, not as conquerors, but as traders and explorers and allies. Human doctors shared medical techniques that had been developed on their Deathworld to fight diseases no other species had ever imagined. Human engineers helped build infrastructure on worlds that had been neglected by the Concordat for centuries. Human teachers established schools where the children of former slave species learned that they too could stand up for themselves. And human soldiers trained alongside the warriors of species who had once trembled at the sound of HFY war drums. The galaxy changed slowly, but it changed fundamentally. Species that had accepted subjugation for generations began to demand better treatment, and the Concordat found itself evolving from an empire into something more like a true federation. The HFY themselves eventually rejoined galactic civilization after a generation of rebuilding and reconciliation. Their children learned about the war in history classes, and they struggled to understand how their ancestors had so badly misjudged the humans in the great archives of the Concordat. The entry for Earth was eventually updated with new information. It still carried the classification of Class 12, Deathworld, and the warnings about the hostile environment and dangerous life forms remained. But someone had added a footnote at the bottom of the entry that captured something the original surveyors had never understood. The footnote read that Earth was the homeworld of the species that had taught the galaxy what survival truly meant and what it cost to threaten those who had learned its lessons. And across 1,000 worlds, the children of 1,000 species grew up knowing that somewhere in the galaxy there was a small blue planet where impossible things were ordinary, a world where life itself was a battle that had to be won every single day, a world that had produced beings who refused to accept defeat no matter how impossible the odds. A world called Earth, home of the humans, the Deathworlders who had changed everything.